The mountains have a way of lying. They promise peace, but they deliver a silence so heavy it can crush a man's soul. In the High Rockies, winter does not leave quietly. It feigns retreat. It offers a false spring, a golden warmth that seduces you into lowering your guard. That is when the frost strikes hardest. Arthur Thorne believed the winter was over. He trusted the sun. He didn't know that the brightness was a blade, sharpening itself against the snow. Lydia Cross knew. She had stopped speaking years ago, but she knew how to listen to the warning in the wind. Welcome back to Frontier Rescue Stories. Today we bring you a tale of deception, silence, and the brutal cost of trust. Have you ever been burned by a warmth you thought was safe? Join us for The Silence of the Snow. If you love stories of survival, hit that subscribe button. Let's begin. Lydia Cross stood in the dark. It was the only place that felt honest. The air in the root cellar was thick and heavy. It smelled of damp earth, old sawdust, and the sharp tang of kerosene. This was her domain. Above her head the world was bright and loud, but down here everything was sleeping. She ran her hand over the rough wood of an apple barrel. The fruit inside was cool and firm. The sawdust packed around them kept them safe. It kept them hidden, just like her. Lydia was not a woman of words. The town of Silverton had forgotten the sound of her voice 3 years ago. She preferred the quiet. She preferred the safety of the dark. But the mountain was shifting. She could feel it in the timber beams above her. Lydia climbed the wooden ladder, her movements slow and deliberate. Her boots made a soft thud against the puncheon floor of the cabin. The cabin was her shell. Her father had built it with saddle-notched logs. The round timbers hugged each other at the corners, locking tight against the wind. It was a sturdy place, built to withstand the rage of December. But today the wind was not raging. It was whispering. Lydia walked to the heavy oak door. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the iron latch. She pulled it and pushed the door open. The light hit her like a physical blow. She squinted against the glare. The world was blindingly white, but it was the heat that frightened her. It was late February. The air should have been biting. It should have frozen the breath in her lungs instantly. Instead, the breeze was soft. It was unnervingly warm. The thermometer nailed to the porch post read 60 degrees. Water dripped from the eaves. Drip, drip, drip. It sounded like a clock ticking down. Lydia stepped out onto the porch. The snow was softening. It was turning to slush under her boots. The albedo, the reflection of the sun off the snow, was intense, stinging her eyes even in the few seconds she looked out. She looked down at the garden patch. There, pushing through the melting crust, was a splash of purple. A pasquiflower, the windflower. Its petals were open to the sun. The stem was covered in fine, white fuzz, trying to protect itself from a cold it didn't know was coming. Lydia knelt and touched the flower. It felt soft. It felt foolish. Liar, she thought. This was not spring. This was the false spring. It was a trick. The mountain was waking up just to catch the careless. The warmth would bring the sap up in the trees, and the frost that followed would shatter them. She stood up and wiped her dirt-stained hands on her apron. She scanned the ridgeline, expecting to see nothing but pine and rock. She was wrong. A figure stood on the crest of the hill. A man. He was silhouetted against the blinding blue sky. He was standing tall, looking out over the valley as if he owned it. He held a notebook in one hand, sketching the treacherous beauty before him. Lydia froze. She saw him reach up and do the one thing no man should do in this light. He took off his goggles. He wiped his face, smiling at the sun. He let the glare flood into his unprotected eyes. Lydia's hand went to her throat. She wanted to scream a warning. She wanted to tell him that the sun was a knife, but her voice was a rusted lock. She watched, silent and helpless, as the stranger walked confidently down the slope, marching straight into the trap. Lydia did not move from the porch. She stood like a statue carved from the saddle-notched logs behind her, her hand gripping the rough iron of the door latch. She watched the stranger descend the slope. He moved with a loose, easy gait, the walk of a man who thought the mountain was his friend. He paused every few yards to check his notebook, squinting against the glare of the snowfield. The heat was rising. It was unnatural. The thermometer on the post now read 62 degrees. It was the kind of warmth that made the sap run too early in the pines. It was the kind of warmth that woke the bears before there was food to eat. Arthur Thorne reached the bottom of the ridge and stepped onto the flat ground of her homestead. He stopped near the garden patch, where the snow had pulled back to reveal the wet, dark earth. He crouched down. He was looking at the purple heads of the pasque flowers. Lydia saw him smile. He reached out a gloved hand and brushed the petals. He didn't understand what he was touching. He saw a flower and thought of spring. He didn't notice the fine white hairs covering the stem and the sepals. The plant was wearing a fur coat. It knew that this heat was a lie. It was prepared for the frost that was waiting just behind the blue sky. Arthur stood up. He unbuttoned his heavy wool coat, letting it hang open. He took a deep breath of the pine-scented air, exposing his face fully to the sun. Light was everywhere. It hammered down from the sky and exploded upward from the snowpack. The albedo effect was lethal today, the white crust acting like a mirror, doubling the radiation striking his face. He turned and saw her standing on the porch. He waved, a broad, confident gesture. He walked toward her, his boots splashing through the slush. "Morning," he called out. His voice was deep and cheerful, shattering the silence Lydia had carefully cultivated for 3 years. "Or afternoon, I suppose. Hard to tell when the sun is this high." Lydia didn't answer. She didn't step back, but she didn't step forward either. Arthur stopped at the foot of the porch steps. He wiped sweat from his forehead. His eyes were a piercing blue, clear and bright. He blinked, rubbing the corner of one eye casually. "I didn't expect to find a soul out here," he said, resting a boot on the bottom step. "I'm Arthur Thorne, surveyor for the Rio Grande Southern. I'll tell you, I've never seen a February like this. It's a miracle, isn't it?" He gestured to the dripping eaves, to the bright, treacherous world. "Winter's broken," he declared with the arrogance of a man who measured the world with rulers and charts. "The pass is clear. I'd say we're in for an early planting." Lydia looked at his eyes. They were wide open, drinking in the glare. He felt fine now. That was the cruelty of the snow. It didn't hurt you when it burned you. It waited. Pain was a debt, and he would have to pay it tonight. Arthur's smile faltered slightly under her intense, silent gaze. He shifted his weight, looking at the gray wood of the cabin, then back to her. "Cat got your tongue, ma'am?" he asked, his tone softening, trying to bridge the gap. Lydia slowly released her grip on the door latch. She raised a hand and pointed to the horizon, to the north, where the blue sky was turning a bruised, sickly purple. Arthur laughed, shaking his head. "Don't worry about that, clouds. Just a spring shower. It'll pass." He took the final step up onto the porch, crossing the threshold of her safety. He was close enough now that she could smell the wool of his coat and the sweat of his labor. "Do you have any water?" he asked. "I'm parched." Lydia turned and walked into the shadows of the cabin. She would give him water. She would follow the code of the frontier. But as she listened to his heavy boots follow her inside, she knew one thing for certain. He was not leaving this mountain today. Lydia moved through dim interior of the cabin. The contrast was sharp. Inside, air was cool and smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs, a sanctuary from aggressive brightness outside. She reached water bucket near hearth and dipped a tin ladle into it. Water was icy, drawn from deep well that morning before sun had begun its deception. Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted ladle. She did not want this man here. Her silence was a fortress, built log by log over 3 years of solitude. A stranger meant noise. A stranger meant questions she had no voice to answer. But Code of High Country was older than her grief. You did not deny water to a traveler, not even a fool. She walked back to doorway. Arthur was still standing on bottom step, his back to cabin, staring out at blinding expanse of valley. He had taken a notebook from his pocket and was scribbling furiously, squinting against glare. The snowfield acted like a massive mirror, magnifying the sun's rays, bouncing them straight into his unprotected face. Lydia stepped onto porch. Arthur turned at sound of her boots. He took ladle with a grin that was too wide, too trusting. "Much obliged," he said. He drank greedily, water spilling over his chin, dark spots blooming on his wool collar. He handed ladle back, wiping his mouth with back of a gloved hand. "You have a prime spot here, ma'am. The Rio Grande Southern is looking for a grade through this pass. We thought snow would hold us back until April, but look at this. He swept his arm toward peaks. Open country, easy going. Lydia looked at him. He was a surveyor, a man of maps and measurements. He believed that because he could draw a line across a mountain, he had tamed it. He didn't see violence waiting in the air. He didn't know that easy-going slush would turn to sheet ice the moment sun dipped behind ridge. Bright out here, though, Arthur muttered. He rubbed his eyes with his knuckles, a casual, irritated motion. Feels a bit sharp. Lydia's grip on ladle tightened. She knew that sign. It was first whisper of burn. The ultraviolet rays were already scorching delicate surface of his corneas, stripping away cells. He wouldn't feel pain yet, not for hours. That was trap. The blindness came with a delay, waiting until victim was settled and safe before it struck with sensation of hot sand rubbed into eyes. She wanted to reach out and slap his hand away from his face. She wanted to force leather smoke goggles back over his eyes. Words formed in her throat. Cover your eyes, you fool. But they died there, choked off by rust of her silence. Arthur blinked rapidly, trying to clear his vision, still smiling, still ignorant. He looked at her, expecting conversation, expecting a welcome. Lydia simply turned around. She walked back into cabin and set ladle down with a sharp clang. She went to window and looked up at sky. The purple bruise on northern horizon was spreading. The false spring was ending. The mountain was done playing. Arthur was still on the porch, sketching his maps, thinking he had all the time in the world. He didn't know that darkness had already entered him. Arthur sat on the porch rail, his notebook resting on his knee. He sketched with a feverish intensity, capturing curve of the valley he intended to fill with steel and steam. To him, the silence of the High Rockies was not a presence to be respected. It was an emptiness waiting to be filled by the roar of a locomotive. It's a straight shot, he muttered, tapping the charcoal against the paper. We'll have to blast that ridge, but grade holds. By next autumn, you'll hear the whistle, ma'am. Civilization is coming to your doorstep. Lydia watched him from the threshold. She knew what civilization brought. It brought noise. It brought men who took things they didn't understand. She set a tin plate of cured venison and a heel of cornbread on the railing beside him. She did not look at his face, but she saw his hands. They were shaking slightly, not from cold, but from the adrenaline of his own arrogance. He ate quickly, tearing at the bread without looking up from his maps. "You're a quiet one, aren't you?" he said between bites, flashing a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Most folks out here are starving for news. I could tell you about the elections, or the new prices on silver, but you just stare at that horizon like you're waiting for a ghost." He laughed, a sharp, jarring sound in the heavy afternoon air. He rubbed his eyes again, digging the heel of his palm into the socket. "Glare is fierce today," he admitted, squinting at the sun that was beginning to dip toward the western peaks. "But it's worth it. A day like this in February, it's a gift." Lydia gripped her apron. It wasn't a gift. It was a loan with high interest. The afternoon wore on, stretched thin by the unnatural warmth. But as the sun touched the jagged teeth of the San Juans, the lie began to unravel. Change was violent and immediate. Soft, southerly breeze died, replaced instantly by a biting gust from the north. The temperature didn't just slide. It crashed, dropping 20 degrees in the span of an hour. The slush on the ground instantly hardened, glazing the world in treacherous ice. Arthur shivered, pulling his wool coat tighter around his neck. He finally closed his notebook, securing the pages against the rising wind. "Well," he said, standing up and stretching his stiff back. "Looks like that spring shower is turning into a proper chill. Mind if I bed down in your barn loft? I'll be gone at first light." Lydia nodded once, her expression unreadable. She pointed to the barn, a low structure built of rough-hewn timber 50 yards away. She watched him walk away, his boots crunching loudly on the newly formed crust. He waved one last time, a shadow in the dying light, completely unaware that he had just seen his last sunset. He didn't know it yet, but the sun had already done its work. Now the night was coming to collect. Night didn't fall gently. It collapsed. The warmth of the afternoon vanished, as if the sun had never existed, replaced by a cold so sharp it felt like a physical weight pressing against the cabin walls. The thermometer on the porch, which had boasted 60 degrees only hours before, now plummeted past freezing, the mercury shrinking into itself as the wind began to howl from the north. Inside, Lydia sat by the cast-iron stove. She didn't light the oil lamp. She didn't need to see the darkness to know it was there. She listened to the timbers of the cabin groan as they contracted in the sudden chill. But mostly, she listened to the silence from the barn. It had been 6 hours since sunset. The incubation period was almost over. In the loft of the rough-hewn barn, Arthur Thorne stirred under his blankets. He woke not from the cold, but from an itch. He rubbed his eyes with the back of his hand, groggily thinking some dust from the hay had settled on his face. He rolled over, trying to find comfort in the straw, but the irritation persisted. It started small, a feeling of dryness, a subtle scratching every time he blinked. He squeezed his eyes shut, expecting tears to wash it away, but the tears that came felt hot and acidic. The sensation shifted rapidly, evolving from a nuisance into a threat. It felt as though someone had taken a handful of fine river sand and thrown it directly into his open eyes. Arthur sat up in the darkness, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He rubbed his eyes harder, digging his knuckles into the sockets, a natural instinct that was the worst possible reaction. The friction ground the dead cells of his corneas against the raw nerves beneath. The sand turned into shards. A gasp escaped him, a sound of confusion and rising panic. He tried to open his eyes to find the ladder, to find water, but the muscles of his eyelids spasmed shut, locking him in blindness. The pain was excruciating, a searing white-hot agony that felt like broken glass sliding under his lids. Inside the cabin, Lydia's head snapped up. She heard it over the rising wind, a thud against the barn wall, then a sharp, strangled cry. The confident stride of the afternoon was gone. The man who had measured the mountains was now thrashing in the dark, fighting an enemy he couldn't see. The false spring had collected its due, and the payment was agony. Lydia stood up. She reached for her heavy shawl. She didn't need to hear his voice to know what he was saying. The mountain had spoken for him. Lydia pushed the cabin door open, fighting the wind that tried to rip the iron latch from her grip. The storm was no longer a threat on the horizon. It was a physical weight, pressing against the homestead with a violence that shook the ground. She wrapped her shawl tight and crossed the 50 yards of frozen mud to the barn. The air was thick with flying ice crystals, stinging her face like nettles. Inside the barn, the darkness was absolute, broken only by the sound of a man unraveling. Arthur was on his knees in the straw. He was not the surveyor who had confidently mapped the valley hours ago. He was a terrified animal. He was clawing at his face, his fingers hooked into claws, trying to gouge out the source of the agony. "Get it out!" he screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "There's glass! My eyes!" Lydia moved quickly. She knew she had to stop his hands. The sensation of grit or broken glass was a hallucination of the nerves, caused by the sloughing off of the corneal cells. If he rubbed them, he would strip the surface of his eyes raw and cause permanent damage. She grabbed his wrists. He flinched violently, striking out blindly in the dark. "Who's there?" he gasped, his head whipping back and forth. His eyes were clamped shut, the eyelids spasms uncontrollably, blepharospasm, the body's way of locking down against the pain. Lydia didn't speak. She didn't offer empty words of comfort. Instead, she tightened her grip, her calloused fingers digging into his forearms with a strength that shocked him into stillness. She pulled him up. He stumbled, heavy and disoriented, entirely dependent on her balance. The walk back to the cabin was a battle. Arthur was dead weight, flinching at the wind he couldn't see. He kept squeezing his eyes shut, tears streaming down his face, freezing instantly on his cheeks. They crashed through the cabin door and Lydia slammed it shut, dropping the heavy wooden bar into place. The silence of the cabin was sudden and jarring. The roar of the wind was muffled to a dull throb. The heat from the cast-iron stove hit them, thick and radiant. Arthur collapsed into the chair Lydia pushed against the back of his knees. He was shaking, not just from the cold, but from the shock. He reached up again to touch his eyes. "I can't open them," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It burns. God, why does it burn like that?" Lydia caught his hand before it reached his face. She forced it down to his lap. She stood behind him and placed both hands heavily on his shoulders. She pressed down, a grounding weight. She needed him to feel the room since he couldn't see it. She needed him to understand that the chaotic world outside had stopped at the threshold. Arthur froze under her touch. He waited for a voice, for an explanation, but there was only the crackle of the fire and the steady, heavy pressure of her hands. "Help me," he breathed into the silence. Lydia looked down at the top of his head. The arrogance was gone. The surveyor was gone. There was only a man in the dark, and for the first time in 3 years, the silence didn't feel like a wall. It felt like a bridge. Lydia stepped back from the chair. The loss of her touch made Arthur gasp, a sharp intake of breath like a drowning man losing a lifeline. He reached out blindly, his fingers clawing at the empty air. "Don't go," he rasped. "Please." Lydia did not answer. She knew what the mountain demanded now. The sun had burned him, and only the dark could heal him. She moved to the table where the oil lamp sputtered, casting long, dancing shadows against the log walls. With a quick puff of breath, she extinguished the flame. The cabin plunged into absolute blackness. For Arthur, the darkness was terrifying, but it was also a mercy. The throb in his eyes, aggravated by even the dimmest light, began to settle into a dull, rhythmic ache. But his fear spiked. He was a man who defined himself by what he could see. Maps, grades, stars. Now he was adrift in a void. "Lydia?" His voice cracked. It's so dark." Lydia ignored his panic. She moved by memory, her boots silent on the floorboards. She went to the water bucket near the door. The water inside had a layer of ice forming on top, despite the stove's heat. She broke the crust with a ladle, the sound sharp in the quiet room. She took a strip of clean linen from her apron pocket. She soaked it in the freezing water, wringing it out until it was damp and biting cold. She returned to him. Arthur heard the wet drip of the cloth. He flinched, curling in on himself, his hands flying up to rub his eyes again. The sensation of grit was driving him mad. The urge to scour his eyes was irresistible. Lydia moved fast. She caught his wrists in midair. Her grip was iron. She forced his hands down to the arms of the chair and held them there. He struggled for a second, a weak, feverish resistance. "It hurts," he moaned. I just need to get it out." Lydia pressed the cold, wet cloth directly over his eyes. Arthur hissed through his teeth, his back arching off the chair. The cold was a shock, a sudden violence against the fever in his face. But then, the sigh came. His shoulders dropped. The freezing linen numbed the raw nerves of his corneas, dulling the sensation of broken glass. Lydia stood behind him, her hands holding the compress in place. She felt the tension drain out of him, replaced by a heavy, exhausted surrender. He leaned his head back against her stomach, too weak to care about propriety. "Thank you," he whispered. Lydia looked into the dark. She could feel the cabin shudder. Outside, the wind had changed its tone. It was no longer whistling. It was screaming. The false spring was gone. The true winter had returned, and it was angry. The first blow didn't sound like wind. It sounded like a hammer striking the side of the house. Lydia felt the impact through the soles of her boots. The cabin, built from heavy spruce logs and locked with saddle-notched corners, shuddered under the assault. The false spring had vanished as quickly as a thief in the night, leaving the door wide open for the blizzard that had been stalking it. Inside the darkness, the noise was absolute. The silence Lydia had cultivated for years was shattered by a low-frequency roar that vibrated in the chest. It was the sound of air moving at 60 miles an hour, shredded by the rough bark of the timber walls. Arthur gasped, his hands flying off the arms of the chair to grip his own knees. In the pitch black, stripped of his sight, the storm wasn't just weather. It was a monster in the room with them. "Is the roof holding?" he yelled, his voice thin and fragile against the gale. "It sounds like it's coming apart." Lydia didn't answer. She couldn't have made herself heard over the howling wind, even if she had a voice. She moved to the center of the room, her hand resting on the rough-hewn table for balance. She listened, not to the wind, but to the wood. She heard the sharp, pistol-shot crack of the logs contracting. The temperature outside was plummeting so fast, dropping 40 degrees in less than an hour, that the wood fibers were shrinking violently, fighting the iron nails and the gravity that held them together. The cabin was groaning, adjusting its bones to survive the thermal shock. Lydia moved to the cast-iron stove. She opened the door, feeding a heavy piece of oak into the fire. The orange glow flared for a second, illuminating Arthur's terrified face. He was pale, sweat freezing on his forehead, his head cocked to the side as he tried to map the danger by sound alone. To him, the darkness was spinning. The wind whistled through the eaves, a high-pitched scream that cut through the deeper rumble of the storm. He felt the draft snaking along the floorboards, a serpent of cold air that bit through his boots. Lydia placed a hand on his shoulder again, heavier this time. "We are safe," the pressure said. "The logs are strong." But as she squeezed his shoulder, the tone of the wind changed. The deep roar spiked into a shriek near the north wall. Lydia stiffened. She knew every chink, every seal in this house. That sound wasn't the wind against the wood. It was the wind finding a way in. The trap had snapped shut, and the cabin was beginning to bleed heat. The breach didn't start with a bang, but with a hiss, sound of a serpent coiling in corner of room. Lydia turned her head toward north wall, her eyes narrowing in orange glow of stove. For years, mixture of clay, straw, and lime had held gap between third and fourth logs. It had weathered rain and sun, expanding and contracting with the timber. But the violence of this freeze was different. The false spring had soaked the chinking with meltwater, and sudden plunge to sub-zero temperatures had turned that moisture into expanding ice crystals. The mortar didn't just crack, it exploded. A section of dried mud the size of a dinner plate blew inward, scattering across the puncheon floor like shrapnel. Arthur screamed as the wind punched through opening. It wasn't a draft. It was a physical blow. A jet of freezing air, solid and heavy, blasted into the cabin, instantly warring with the heat of the cast-iron stove. Temperature in the room began to free-fall. "What happened?" Arthur yelled, scrambling backward in his chair, his hands shielding his bandaged eyes. "I feel... God, it's freezing!" Lydia didn't waste time checking the hole. She could hear the wind tearing at the edges of the breach, widening it, eating away at the soft straw binder. The cabin, her fortress, had been breached. She looked at the stove. She could stoke it. She could shove every piece of oak she had into the firebox and try to burn the cold away. But she knew the physics of a frontier winter. To heat a room with a hole in the wall against a 60-mile-an-hour gale, she would have to run the stove red hot. That led to one outcome, a chimney fire. They would burn the roof down over their heads before they got warm. Main room was dead. It was no longer a shelter, it was a wind tunnel. Lydia grabbed Arthur's arm. Her grip was urgent, bordering on rough. She didn't guide him this time. She hauled him. "Where are we going?" Arthur panicked, stumbling over his own boots as she pulled him away from the hearth. "Lydia, the fire is here." She ignored him. She pulled him toward the back of the cabin, past the kitchen table, to the darkest corner of the room. Floorboards here were cold, far from the stove. She let go of his arm and dropped to her knees. Arthur stood swaying in the dark, shivering violently as the freezing draft curled around his legs. He heard the scrape of iron against wood. Lydia dug her fingers into the recessed iron ring set flush into the floor. She pulled. Heavy trapdoor groaned on stiff leather hinges, lifting to reveal a square of absolute blackness beneath the floor. A scent wafted up, not the sterile cold of the storm, but something damp, earthy, and ancient. It smelled of raw potatoes and deep soil. Lydia stood up and took Arthur's hand, placing it on the edge of the open hatch. She pushed down on his shoulder, forcing him to his knees. He resisted, terrified of the hole he couldn't see. "Down," she thought, the word echoing in her silent throat. "We go down." Lydia pushed him, and Arthur stumbled, his boots finding the rungs of the ladder by accident more than intent. He descended into the earth, a blind man falling into a grave. Lydia followed, the heavy oak trapdoor groaning on its leather hinges as she lowered it shut above them. The slam was final. The screaming wind, which had been tearing the cabin apart just seconds ago, was instantly severed. The roar didn't vanish, but it changed. It became a dull, rhythmic thumping, like the heartbeat of a dying giant, felt through the timber beams of the ceiling rather than heard. They were in the cold cellar. The atmosphere here was thick and heavy. It didn't smell of the sterile, biting ice outside. It smelled of life that was sleeping. The air was damp, holding the scent of raw potatoes, turnips, and the sweet fermentation-tinged odor of apples stored in sawdust. It was the smell of the earth's gut. Arthur collapsed at the foot of the ladder, his breathing ragged and loud in the sudden quiet. He was shivering, but the cellar was not freezing. It held a constant subterranean temperature, cool, clammy, but stable. "Lydia," he whispered. The panic in his voice was sharp. "It feels like a coffin." Lydia ignored him. She moved through the absolute darkness with the grace of someone who had memorized every inch of her cage. Her hand brushed against the rough stone walls, feeling the moisture. She knew the storm wasn't done with them yet. She reached up, her fingers finding the wooden ventilation pipe that poked through the foundation wall. This pipe was the cellar's lung, allowing it to breathe during the winter to keep the rot away. Now, it was a liability. She could feel a thin, deadly stream of sub-zero air whistling through it. She ripped a strip of cloth from her apron, the sound loud in the small space, and jammed it deep into the pipe, twisting it tight until the whistle stopped. She did the same for the lower vent near the floor. The cellar was now sealed. She turned back to Arthur. He was huddled against a barrel, his knees pulled to his chest. He was terrified of the dark, but Lydia knew the truth. The darkness was the medicine. The cool, humid air of the root cellar was a balm for his scorched corneas, far better than the dry heat of the stove upstairs. She sat down beside him in the sawdust. She didn't touch him yet. She just let him listen to the silence of the earth, waiting for him to realize that being buried was the only thing that would keep them alive. Time lost its shape in the dark. There was no sunrise or sunset in the root cellar, only the steady rhythmic thrum of the blizzard vibrating through the dirt walls. It was a heartbeat of violence, muffled by 6 feet of soil and stone. Lydia found a heavy buffalo robe folded atop a crate of winter squash. It smelled of dust and dried sage, a scent of old summers preserved in the dark. She draped it over Arthur's shoulders. He flinched at the weight, his survival instincts still wrapped tight before sinking into the warmth with a ragged exhale. They sat side by side in the sawdust, backs against the rough-hewn potato bins. The air was damp and cool, sitting heavy in the lungs. For Arthur, the absolute darkness was no longer a terror. It was a bandage. The crushing pain in his eyes had dulled to a rhythmic throbbing, a bruise deep inside his skull. "I'm a surveyor," he said suddenly. His voice was small in the enclosed space, stripped of the booming confidence he had worn on the porch. "That's what I do. I measure things." Lydia didn't move. She let her silence invite him in. "I have a theodolite," he continued, speaking to the dark. "It cost more than my father made in a lifetime. It uses lenses and mirrors to slice the world into angles, degrees, minutes, seconds. I thought if I could measure this mountain, I could tame it. If I could draw a line across it, it would have to obey me." He laughed, a dry, brittle sound. He reached up to touch the wet cloth over his eyes, his fingers trembling. "I came out here because I failed back east," he confessed. "I designed a bridge in Pennsylvania. On paper, the geometry was perfect. The math was flawless. But I didn't account for the ice. I didn't account for the river waking up angry." Lydia shifted in the sawdust, the sound soft and grounding. She reached out and rested her hand on his forearm. Arthur leaned into her touch. "I saw those flowers today. That false spring. I wanted it to be true so badly. I wanted the easy path. I looked right at the sun and thought I was its equal." He turned his head toward where he sensed she was sitting. Tears, hot and unbidden, leaked from under the compress, tracking through the dirt on his cheeks. "I measured the elevation. I measured the grade. I measured the distance to the horizon," he whispered, the words breaking. "I thought I saw everything. I saw nothing." "You judge yourself for seeing too much," Arthur whispered into the damp silence. "But why do you say nothing? Are you punished?" Lydia did not pull away. His confession had cracked something open in the heavy air of the cellar. He had stripped himself of his pride, admitting that his instruments had failed him. It was only fair that she lower her shield. She reached out and took his hand. It was trembling, likely from the residual pain in his eyes, or the cold that was slowly seeping through the ventilation pipe she had plugged. She turned his hand over, exposing the palm. She began to write. She did not use a pen. She used the tip of her index finger, pressing firmly into the calloused valley of his hand. She traced a vertical line, then a curve. Sound. She waited. Arthur's breath hitched. He felt the shape of the letter lingering on his skin, a fictive writing that required him to hold the ghost of the character in his mind. Sound? Arthur whispered the word into the blackness. Lydia squeezed his thumb. Yes. She continued. The method was slow, a rhythmic pressure that required total focus. She traced the letters of her history one by one, forcing him to build the words in the dark. My husband. Arthur went rigid against the crate. The wind outside thumped against the earth-covered roof, a dull, rhythmic bass drum that vibrated through the soil. I called. Snow fell. The story entered him not through his ears, but through his skin. He felt the jagged edge of the A in avalanche. He felt the trembling curve of the G in gone. She described the day the mountain broke loose, triggered, she believed, by the sound of her own voice echoing off the canyon wall. She had been happy that day. She had shouted to them. The mountain had answered with white death. Since then, she had sealed her lips. She believed that her voice was a weapon. If sound could kill, then silence was the only way to keep the world safe. Arthur closed his hand around hers, trapping her fingers against his palm. He didn't pull away. He didn't offer the empty platitudes of the city. He understood the logic of the frontier now. He had thought he could measure the mountains with tools. She was trying to control them by holding her breath. It wasn't your voice, Lydia, he said softly, his own voice cracking in the dark. It was the winter. It takes what it wants. You didn't break the mountain. He felt a wet drop hit the back of his hand, then another. In the absolute dark of the root cellar, stripped of his sight and his arrogance, Arthur Thorne finally saw her clearly. The darkness of the root cellar was no longer a prison. It had become a womb. For 36 hours, time had been measured only by the rhythmic thumping of the blizzard against the frozen earth above and the steady rise and fall of their breathing. But now, the vibration in the soil had ceased. The angry, rhythmic pounding that had shaken the timber rafters was gone, replaced by a stillness so profound it rang in the ears. Arthur shifted against the potato bin. His hand went to his face, fingers hovering tentatively over his eyelids. For the first time in 2 days, he did not wince. The sensation of broken glass, the jagged, gritty agony that had driven him to the edge of madness, had receded. What remained was a dull, heavy ache, like a bruise that was slowly fading from purple to yellow. The glass is gone, he whispered, his voice raspy from dehydration. It just feels heavy now. Lydia heard the change in him. The fever of the injury had broken. She moved through the pitch black with the surety of a nocturnal creature, her boots scuffing softly against the sawdust. She reached up to the high shelf, her fingers brushing past the rough burlap of the seed sacks until she found cool glass. She gripped the jar of preserved peaches. She wedged the tip of a small knife under the lid and twisted. Pop. The sound of the seal breaking was explosively loud in the quiet space, releasing a sudden, sharp aroma of sweetness into the damp, earthy air. She moved back to Arthur. She didn't speak. She simply guided his hand to the jar, then pressed a spoon into his palm. Arthur took a slice. The texture was slippery and soft, a shocking contrast to the dry, gritty reality of the last 2 days. He put it in his mouth. The taste was overwhelming: sugar, sunlight, and the memory of a July orchard, preserved in syrup and hidden beneath the frost. It was a true spring, caught in a jar, safe and honest. Summer, Arthur breathed, swallowing the fruit. He took another bite, the syrup running unheeded over his chin. I forgot what it tasted like. Lydia watched him in the dark, sensing his relief. She ate a slice herself, the sweetness cutting through the stale taste of fear that had coated her tongue. They sat there for a long time, passing the jar back and forth, sharing the last of the harvest. Above them, the ventilation pipe she had plugged remained silent. The wind wasn't whistling anymore. The monster outside had exhausted itself. Arthur set the empty jar down in the sawdust. He tilted his head back, listening. "It's over, isn't it?" he asked softly. Lydia reached out and tapped his knee twice. "Yes." The false spring had tempted them. The storm had tried to bury them, but the earth had held them. Now, it was time to see what was left of the world. Lydia pushed against the heavy oak trapdoor. It resisted for a moment, stiff with the chill that had settled into the wood, before groaning open on its leather hinges. The temperature drop was violent. The air in the root cellar had been cool and damp, like the breath of a sleeping animal. The air in the cabin was sharp enough to cut. It smelled of wet ash, frozen iron, and the metallic tang of ozone. Lydia climbed the ladder first, her boots crunching on the frost that had coated the puncheon floor during the night. The cabin was a shipwreck of winter. The hole in the north wall, where the chinking had blown out, was rimmed with a drift of fine, dry snow that had spilled across the floorboards like spilled flour. The cast-iron stove was dead, a cold black monolith in the center of the room. The water in the bucket was frozen solid, split down the middle by the expansion of the ice. She reached down and tapped Arthur's shoulder. He ascended slowly, his movements stiff. He kept his head bowed, his eyes squeezed tight against a light he couldn't yet see. He was afraid to test the mountain's mercy. Is it bright?" he asked, his voice trembling in the freezing room. Lydia did not push him. She took the buffalo robe from his shoulders and wrapped it tighter around him, pulling the collar up to shield his face. She guided him past the dead stove, past the debris of the storm, to the front door. She lifted the heavy wooden bar. It was frozen in its bracket, requiring a sharp blow from her palm to dislodge. She pushed the door outward. It didn't swing free. It crunched against a wall of drift, requiring her to lean her shoulder into the wood. With a heavy shove, the door carved a path through the snow, flooding the cabin with the clean, harsh light of morning. The false spring was a memory. The world had been reset. The valley was buried under 2 feet of fresh, honest snow. The slush and mud of the day before were gone, entombed under a pristine white sheet that smoothed over every rock and fence line. The purple pasca flowers, which had been foolish enough to trust the warmth, were gone, buried deep beneath the drift, their silk coats unable to save them from the truth of February. Arthur stood in the doorway, the brightness washing over him. He flinched, turning his face away, his hands coming up to cover his eyes. He wasn't just afraid of the pain returning, he was afraid of what he would see. He feared that if he opened his eyes, the intimacy of the dark would vanish, burned away like morning fog. "Lydia," he whispered, standing on the threshold of the blinding white world. "I'm afraid to look." Arthur stood frozen in the doorway. He trembled, not from the cold, but from the memory of the fire that had consumed his sight. The fear was a physical weight. He kept his eyes squeezed shut, terrified that if he opened them, the darkness of the cellar would follow him out into the light, or worse, that the searing white pain would return to claim him. Lydia stepped out onto the porch. She did not pull him. She simply stood in the snow, her boots planted firmly in the fresh drift. She breathed in the sharp, clean air, letting the silence of the morning settle over them. It was a different silence now. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating quiet of the storm, nor the deceptive hush of the false spring. It was the peaceful silence of endurance. She reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were rough, calloused from years of chopping wood and hauling water. But to Arthur, they felt like an anchor. She squeezed his palm 3 times. "You are safe." Arthur took a shallow breath. Slowly, agonizingly, he peeled his eyelids apart. He expected agony. He expected the grit of broken glass. Instead, there was only a dull ache, a reminder of the lesson he had learned. He blinked, tears streaming down his cheeks as his eyes adjusted to the brilliance of the world. He saw the snow. It was no longer a blinding mirror meant to trick him. It was a blanket, heavy and white, tucking the mountain in to sleep. He saw the pines, bowed under the weight of the night's fury, yet unbroken. Then he turned to Lydia. For the first time, he truly saw her. He didn't see a mute hermit or a woman abandoned by the town. He saw the gray in her hair that matched the iron of the stove. He saw the strength in her shoulders that had carried him through the dark. He saw the kindness in her eyes that had spoken when her voice could not. He realized then that his maps were useless here. You could not measure this kind of strength with a theodolite. You could not survey loyalty. He had come to the mountains looking for a route for his railroad, a path to bring the world to the wilderness. But standing on this porch, holding the hand of the woman who had saved him, Arthur realized he didn't want to bring the world here. He wanted to keep this world exactly as it was. "I can see," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He turned fully toward her, cupping her face in his hands. His thumbs traced the line of her jaw. "I see you, Lydia." Lydia didn't look away. She stepped closer, closing the gap between them. She didn't need to speak to tell him he was home. The solitude she had guarded for 3 years had been shattered, not by the storm, but by the peace that comes after it. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a partner. Arthur lowered his head. He kissed her, soft and hesitant at first, then deeper, a seal on a promise made without words. It was a kiss that tasted of second chances and the sweetness of preserved peaches. In that embrace, the surveyor died and a mountain man was born. They weren't strangers waiting out a storm. They were a family forged in the dark. Moral of the story: we are often blinded by the warmth we desire, but true vision is found in the darkness we survive together. And that brings us to the end of The Silence of the Snow. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the things we trust the most can hurt us, and the silence we fear is exactly what we need to heal. If Lydia and Arthur's journey touched you, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And I want to ask you, have you ever had a false spring in your own life? Something that looked too good to be true and turned out to be a trap? Let me know your story in the comments below. If you're hungry for more tales of survival and grit, check out the playlist on your screen right now. Until next time, keep your fire lit and your eyes on the horizon. Take care.